Sir, I don't care what that paper says. No outside food or drink, and that includes your water bottle. Those are the rules. Back of the line or leave. The words cut through the excited chatter of the crowd gathered outside the riverfront amphitheater. The summer evening was perfect, temperature in the mid-70s, a gentle breeze carrying the distant sound of sound checks from inside the venue, and the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the plaza where hundreds of eager concertgoers waited to enter the sold-out show. At security checkpoint 3, the flow of people had suddenly stopped. A man in a wheelchair sat quietly facing a red-faced security guard whose stance, arms crossed, chin jutting forward, telegraphed his impatience. The older man held up a medical ID card and a small water bottle, his voice too soft to carry beyond the immediate vicinity. Like I said, the security guard continued loudly, gesturing to a large sign listing prohibited items, no exceptions. You think I haven't heard every excuse in the book? Either dump it out or go home. Several people in line began to shift uncomfortably, exchanging glances as the confrontation unfolded. A young man standing behind the wheelchair leaned forward, whispering something to the older man, who shook his head slightly, maintaining his composure despite the growing tension. It's medically necessary, the man in the wheelchair explained, his voice steady but tired. I need to take my medication on schedule. The documentation explains, not my problem. The guard cut him off, waving his hand dismissively. I've got 3,000 people to process tonight, and the rules apply to everyone. No special treatment. The elderly man's weathered hands tightened slightly on the wheels of his chair. He wore a faded blue button-up shirt, khaki pants that hung loosely on his thin frame, and a pair of well-worn leather shoes. Nothing about his appearance suggested anything remarkable, just another concert-goer eager to enjoy the evening's performance. Only a small, barely noticeable pin on his collar hinted at a military connection. The security guard tapped his foot impatiently, making a show of checking his watch. Decision time, sir. Dump the water or leave. You're holding up the line. Behind them, the amphitheater's massive LED display lit up as the venue prepared for the night's performance. Staff members hurried about, checking equipment and directing VIP guests through a separate entrance. Everything about the scene spoke of an ordinary summer concert, except for the quiet confrontation brewing at Checkpoint 3, where an invisible line had been drawn between a man with a badge and a man in a wheelchair. I can't do that, the elderly man said quietly, dignity evident in every word. This isn't a convenience, it's a necessity. The guard's face darkened as he reached for his radio. James Winters had once stood tall at 6 foot woe, but now at 64, his world existed from the vantage point of a wheelchair that had become as much a part of him as the medals he kept in a small wooden box at home. His silver hair was cut in a style that hadn't changed in 4 decades, short on the sides, neatly combed on top, a habit from his 22 years in the Marine Corps that he saw no reason to abandon in civilian life. Deep lines mapped his weathered face, telling stories of desert suns and mountain winters, while his eyes, alert and observant, missed nothing despite his physical limitations. Tonight was special. For months, James had saved from his modest veteran's pension to purchase these tickets not for himself, but for his grandson Michael's 22nd birthday. The boy, though James still thought of the young man as a boy, stood protectively behind his grandfather's wheelchair, his face a mixture of concern and anger at the situation unfolding. The security guard, whose name badge identified him as Chad Peterson, security supervisor, was perhaps in his early 30s. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and his expression suggested he took immense satisfaction in the minor authority his position provided. A walkie-talkie hung from his belt alongside a small canister of pepper spray and a ring of keys that jangled whenever he moved, creating a sound that seemed to announce his importance. Look, Chad said, his voice carrying the practiced condescension of someone who enjoyed denying requests. I've got a job to do. Everyone thinks their situation is special. If I make one exception, I'll have to make 100. What Chad couldn't see was the Marine Corps emblem discreetly engraved on the side of James' wheelchair, or the small purple heart pin partially hidden by the collar of his shirt. Nor could he know that beneath the loose-fitting khakis were the scars and damaged nerves that necessitated the medication James needed to take precisely every 4 hours to manage his pain, medication that required water to swallow. James had endured far worse than an overzealous security guard. His expression remained calm, his hands steady as he once again attempted to explain his situation, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to without having to raise his volume. "The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations," James said evenly. "My medical necessities are documented right here." Chad rolled his eyes dramatically. Everyone's suddenly a lawyer when they don't get their way. "For all I know, you printed that paper yourself this morning." Around them, the line had grown longer, with some concert-goers craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. A few had pulled out phones, quietly recording the interaction. One woman in line behind James whispered to her companion, "That's not right, how they're treating that man." Michael's hands tightened on the handles of his grandfather's wheelchair. The young man had his grandfather's build, but none of his restraint. The muscles in his jaw worked as he struggled to keep silent, honoring his grandfather's whispered request not to make a scene. Comment, "Respect our veterans. If you believe those who served our country deserve better treatment than this." James Winters had faced enemy fire in 3 conflicts. He had led men through situations where fear was as constant as oxygen. Yet here, in a place of leisure and celebration, a concert he had looked forward to for months, he found himself fighting a different kind of battle, one against rigid bureaucracy and the casual disrespect of someone who couldn't begin to understand the sacrifices hidden beneath his unassuming appearance. Chad raised his walkie-talkie to his lips, his eyes never leaving James. "Checkpoint 3 to security lead. I need additional personnel for a situation." The radio crackled with a brief acknowledgement. "This isn't necessary," James said, his voice still measured despite the growing audience of onlookers. "My grandson and I have been looking forward to this concert for months. All I need is to keep my water bottle for medication purposes. I'm happy to have it inspected or sealed." Chad's expression hardened. "Rules are rules. If I let you through with that water bottle, what's to stop anyone from claiming medical necessity? I'd be risking my job." 2 additional security guards approached from inside the venue, their faces neutral but postures tense as they assessed the situation. The taller of the 2 leaned down as Chad whispered something to him, then straightened and looked at James with newfound suspicion. "Sir," the new guard addressed James, "we have water for purchase inside the venue. Whatever medication you need can be taken with that." "My medication needs to be taken precisely at 8:45, James explained patiently. "By that time, we'll be seated, and accessing concessions would mean missing part of the show my grandson paid good money to see. Additionally, venue water costs $6 a bottle, which is an undue burden for something I've already provided for myself." Around them, the whispers grew louder. A woman with 2 teenagers stepped out of line and approached a different security checkpoint, apparently deciding to avoid the growing tension. Others, however, seemed reluctant to move, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. "Do you know what my grandfather did for this country?" Michael finally spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. 22 years of service. He was in Mogadishu. He's got more than earned the right to." "Michael," James interrupted gently, placing a weathered hand on his grandson's arm. "It's all right." Chad rolled his eyes again, more dramatically this time. "Everyone's a hero these days. Listen, kid, I don't care if he was in Disneyland or Timbuktu. Rules are rules." A ripple of disapproval moved through the closest bystanders. Someone muttered, "Show some respect," but Chad either didn't hear or chose to ignore it. The digital clock on the venue's facade showed 7:42 p.m. The concert was scheduled to start at 8:30, and lines at all security checkpoints continued to grow. Impatient voices from the back of the line called out, asking about the delay. "Final warning," Chad said, crossing his arms. "Dispose of the water bottle or exit the premises." James reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out another document. "This is a letter from my VA doctor explaining that I need to take my medication with water at specific intervals due to my service-connected disability. It's officially stamped and dated last month." Chad barely glanced at the paper before shaking his head. "Anyone could fake that. Sorry, not good enough." One of the other security guards shifted uncomfortably, leaning in to whisper something to Chad, who cut him off with a sharp gesture. James checked his watch, a simple timepiece with a worn leather band that had seen better days. "I have precisely 63 minutes until my next required medication. Missing that window would result in significant pain due to my condition." "Should have thought about that before you came," Chad replied, the cruelty in his voice no longer disguised. "Not my problem." Michael's face flushed with anger. "This is discrimination." "You can't." "I absolutely can," Chad interrupted. "And if you keep this up, Neither of you will be attending the concert. I can refuse entry to anyone creating a disturbance. His hand moved to rest on the radio at his hip, a not-so-subtle threat. By now, at least a dozen people had their phones out, recording the confrontation. A security guard from another checkpoint glanced over nervously, clearly recognizing the potential for a public relations disaster, but made no move to intervene. James remained dignified, his posture straight despite the obvious discomfort of sitting in the wheelchair for an extended period. The small purple heart pin on his collar caught the fading sunlight, a tiny flash of recognition for sacrifices that Chad couldn't begin to comprehend. "Young man," James said, addressing Chad directly, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation for a documented disability, as provided for by law." Chad's response was cut short by the sudden crackle of his radio and an urgent voice demanding his attention. Frowning, he stepped away to respond, throwing a warning glance at James and Michael that clearly conveyed his message: don't move. The first indication that something extraordinary was happening came from the sudden change in the security team's demeanor. Several guards touched their earpieces simultaneously, exchanging startled glances. Chad's radio erupted with chatter, multiple voices overlapping with an urgency that hadn't been present moments before. Then came the vehicles, 3 black SUVs with government plates and tinted windows, rolling to a synchronized stop at the VIP entrance 50 yards from where James sat. The headlights cut through the gathering dusk before extinguishing in perfect unison. The crowd, sensing something significant, fell into a curious hush. The doors of the lead vehicle opened first. 2 men in crisp military dress uniforms emerged, scanning the area with practiced efficiency before nodding toward the middle SUV. The atmosphere shifted palpably as the rear door opened and a commanding figure stepped out. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the authority of the man now walking purposefully toward the security checkpoint. Tall and straight-backed, his dress uniform adorned with rows of medals and insignia that caught the venue's lights and flashes of gold and silver, he moved with the confident precision of someone accustomed to immediate respect. 4 additional officers flanked him, their movements synchronized as if choreographed. "What's happening?" Chad demanded of no one in particular, his earlier confidence visibly faltering as the uniformed contingent approached. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a clear path through which the military officers moved. Several concertgoers snapped to attention, recognizing the significance of the stars adorning the lead officer's shoulders. When the group reached security checkpoint 3, the lead officer, a man whose weathered face spoke of decades of service, paused directly in front of James Winters. For 3 heartbeats, there was complete silence. Then, with deliberate formality, the officer raised his hand in a perfect salute. "Master Sergeant Winters," he said, his deep voice carrying enough authority to silence the entire area. "It's an honor to see you again, sir." James, visibly surprised, returned the salute with ingrained precision despite his seated position. "General Reynolds," he acknowledged, recognition dawning in his eyes. "This is unexpected." General Marcus Reynolds, the 4 stars on his uniform identifying him as one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military, stood at attention before the man in the wheelchair. Behind him, the 6 officers maintained their formal posture, creating a tableau that drew every eye in the vicinity. "Your grandson sent a text to my aide," the general explained, gesturing to a younger officer who stood slightly behind him. "Captain Lewis served with your son in Afghanistan. When he saw the message, he brought it to my immediate attention." The general turned his attention to Chad, who had gone pale, his earlier swagger evaporated entirely. "You are C.H. Chad Peterson, security supervisor," came the stammered response. "Well, Mr. Peterson," General Reynolds said, his tone polite but with an undercurrent of steel that made everyone within earshot stand a little straighter, "I'm General Marcus Reynolds, United States Special Operations Command. I understand there's an issue regarding Master Sergeant Winters' medical accommodations." Chad opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Sir, I was just following venue policy about outside beverages." "I didn't know." "I see," the general interrupted, his voice remaining measured. "And when Master Sergeant Winters presented his medical documentation, you still denied him accommodation." The security supervisor's face flushed. "We have protocols." "Indeed," General Reynolds nodded. "Protocols are important. So is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which federal law requires all venues to adhere to. Perhaps more importantly, So his respect for a man whose service to this country earned him our nation's highest military decorations. By now, the crowd had grown utterly silent, many recording the scene on their phones. Venue staff began to appear from various entrances, drawn by the unusual activity and the unmistakable presence of high-ranking military officers at their security checkpoint. General Reynolds turned back to James. "Master Sergeant, with your permission, I'd like to resolve this situation." James nodded once, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. "Thank you, General, but this really isn't necessary." On the contrary, Reynolds replied, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "It's long overdue." He turned to one of his officers. "Major Collins, please locate the venue manager immediately. Inform them that General Reynolds requests their presence regarding an ADA compliance issue involving a Medal of Honor recipient." The officer saluted sharply and moved off with purpose. Another officer stepped forward, leaning in to speak quietly to the general, who nodded before addressing the growing crowd of staff and concertgoers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption to your evening," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the plaza. "I assure you this matter will be resolved promptly." The digital clock on the venue's facade now read 8:05 p.m. 25 minutes until showtime, and the security lines had come to a complete standstill as all eyes remained fixed on the extraordinary scene unfolding at Checkpoint 3. A harried-looking woman in business attire hurried through the crowd, followed by Major Collins. Her name badge identified her as Diana Kruger, Venue Operations Manager, and her expression shifted from annoyance to concern as she took in the scene, particularly the military contingent standing at attention around a man in a wheelchair. "General Reynolds," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Diana Kruger, Operations Manager. What seems to be the problem?" The general shook her hand firmly. "Ms. Kruger, I'd like to introduce you to Master Sergeant James Winters, United States Marine Corps, retired." His voice took on a different quality as he continued, each word measured and deliberate. "Master Sergeant Winters is a recipient of the Medal of Honor, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. He is also, as you can see, a disabled veteran trying to attend a concert with his grandson." Diana's eyes widened. "Medal of Honor?" she repeated, looking at James with newfound reverence. "Indeed," the general confirmed. "Perhaps you're unaware of the story. Allow me to enlighten you, and everyone else present." He raised his voice slightly, ensuring it carried to the gathered crowd. "Mogadishu, 1993. Master Sergeant Winters, then a staff sergeant, was part of a special operations team caught in an ambush. One day, our position was overrun. Sergeant Winters, despite already being wounded, held off enemy combatants while coordinating the evacuation of 14 injured teammates. A complete hush had fallen over the security area. Even those who had been impatient about the delay stood transfixed by the general's words. Among those Sergeant Winters saved that day was a young lieutenant. Me. The general's voice softened momentarily, then regained its authoritative tone. Staff Sergeant Winters continued fighting despite suffering severe injuries that would eventually cost him the use of his legs. He personally eliminated 11 enemy combatants and maintained his position until the last of his team was evacuated. His actions that day are taught at West Point as an example of extraordinary valor under fire. James kept his eyes fixed on the ground, the quiet dignity of his bearing in stark contrast to the grand narrative of heroism the general described. "Master Sergeant Winters has been denied a basic accommodation for his service-connected disability by your staff," General Reynolds continued, looking directly at the venue manager. "His medical documentation has been dismissed as potentially fraudulent, and he has been threatened with removal from the premises for simply needing water to take his medication. Medication he requires as a direct result of injuries sustained while saving American lives." By now, Diana Kruger looked mortified. "General, I assure you this is not how we operate." "I had no idea. Few people do," the general interrupted gently. "That's by design. Heroes like Master Sergeant Winters don't wear their medals every day. They don't introduce themselves by listing their accomplishments. But make no mistake, Ms. Kruger," he paused, looking around at the gathered crowd, "heroes walk among us every day, asking for nothing more than basic dignity and respect." Chad stood frozen, his face having transitioned from pale to ashen as the full impact of his actions became clear. Several of his fellow security guards had taken small steps away from him, physically distancing themselves from his conduct. The venue manager turned to James. Master Sergeant Winters, I cannot begin to apologize adequately for this unconscionable treatment. Of course your medical necessities will be accommodated. She rounded on Chad. Mr. Peterson, please report to my office immediately after your shift. For now, you're relieved of duty. Chad opened his mouth to protest, but thought better of it upon noticing the general's steady gaze. He nodded once and quickly retreated toward the staff entrance, several phone cameras tracking his departure. That's not all, General Reynolds interjected. I'm here with several members of the Joint Special Operations Command for this evening's concert. We were going to enjoy it privately, but given these circumstances, I believe a more formal acknowledgement is in order. He gestured to one of his aides, who stepped forward with a radio. After a brief exchange, the large screens flanking the stage inside the venue flickered to life, visible through the glass frontage of the amphitheater. The pre-show advertisements disappeared, replaced by the seal of the United States Special Operations Command. Ms. Kruger, the general continued, with your permission, I'd like to make a brief announcement to all attendees regarding not only this incident, but the wider issue it represents. The manager nodded, still visibly shaken. Of course, General. Anything you need. The clock now read 8:22 p.m. The scheduled start time was approaching, but no one in the crowd showed any signs of impatience. Instead, phones continued to record, social media posts were being composed in real time, and all eyes remained fixed on the unexpected drama unfolding at what should have been a routine security checkpoint. James Winters, the unwitting center of this attention, finally spoke. General, this really isn't necessary. My grandson and I just want to enjoy the concert. I understand, General Reynolds replied softly, for a moment speaking not as a four-star general but as the young lieutenant whose life James had saved decades ago. But sometimes, Master Sergeant, even heroes need someone to fight for them. The concert began 20 minutes late, but not a single attendee complained. Instead, the delay had transformed into something unexpectedly meaningful. The headline artist, informed of the situation backstage, opened the show with a dedication to all veterans in attendance tonight, especially Medal of Honor recipient Master Sergeant James Winters. James and Michael were escorted to a special viewing area normally reserved for VIPs, complete with comfortable seating that accommodated James's wheelchair and clear sightlines to the stage. More importantly, a small table beside him held his necessary medication and water bottle, no longer contraband but positioned within easy reach. Throughout the venue, something had shifted. Concert-goers who had witnessed the confrontation and resolution shared the story with others, and a wave of respect rippled through the crowd. Several veterans in attendance made their way to James during intermission, offering quiet words of gratitude and respect. General Reynolds and his officers remained for the first 3 songs before departing with quiet efficiency, though not before ensuring that venue management understood the gravity of what had transpired. The operations manager personally oversaw an immediate briefing for all security personnel regarding proper ADA compliance and treatment of veterans with disabilities. Effective immediately, she announced to her assembled staff, we are implementing enhanced training on disability accommodations and proper verification of medical documentation. What happened tonight will not, happen again. The following morning, the venue's social media accounts featured a public apology and announcement of a new initiative, free admission for veterans to all concerts for the remainder of the season, along with dedicated staff trained specifically to assist those with service-connected disabilities. As for Chad Peterson, his employment was terminated before the concert's final encore. His face, captured in dozens of videos that quickly went viral, became an unintended symbol of the casual disrespect that too many veterans encounter in their daily lives. But beyond the public relations aspects and social media attention, the most meaningful moment came during the drive home, when Michael glanced at his grandfather. You never told me about Mogadishu, he said quietly, or about saving a general's life. James smiled slightly, his eyes on the road ahead. There are some things you just do, Michael. Not to be recognized or rewarded, but because they're right. Most heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. They're just trying to live quiet lives with dignity. The lesson wasn't lost on the thousands who shared the videos of that night. Appearances can be deceiving. The unassuming elderly man in a wheelchair might be a decorated hero. The quiet woman in line at the grocery store might have saved lives as a combat medic. The retired teacher might have earned a Bronze Star. Heroes walk among us every day, asking for nothing more than basic respect and dignity. And sometimes, when that respect is denied, Justice arrives in the form of a 4-star general and a lesson that resonates far beyond a single concert venue. Share if you believe our veterans deserve respect, not obstacles, because you never know when the person being disrespected might be a hero who once risked everything for others.